On a bitter winter morning in Georgetown, Delaware, the kind of morning where frost clings to window panes and breath hangs visible in the air, a young woman named Lindsay Bonestall left her apartment to begin what should have been an ordinary day. She was 19 years old, a student at Delaware Technical Community College, working part-time at a local retail store to help pay for her education. She had sandy blonde hair that fell past her shoulders, a quick smile, and the determined stride of someone who knew exactly where she was going. That morning was January 21st, 2007. Lindsay never made it to her destination. By nightfall, her family would be frantic. By week's end, investigators would be searching fields and waterways. By month's end, Georgetown would become the kind of town that locks its doors after dark and watches strangers with suspicious eyes. And for nearly 13 years, one question would haunt this small Delaware community. Whispered in diners and grocery store aisles, discussed in hushed tones at church gatherings and town meetings, what happened to Lindsay Bonestall? Georgetown sits in Sussex County, the southernmost county in Delaware, a place where farmland stretches toward the horizon and small towns carry names that echo colonial history. The county seat, Georgetown, is home to roughly 7,000 people, though that number swells during summer months when tourists pass through on their way to the Atlantic beaches 30 minutes east. In 2007, Georgetown was the kind of place where neighbors knew each other's business, where the local diner served as an informal community center, where high school football games drew crowds that spilled from the bleachers onto the grass. The town center featured a historic circle, a peculiar roundabout where Main Street curved around the old Sussex County Courthouse, a brick building with white columns that had stood since 1839. Around this circle, local businesses occupied buildings that had served the community for generations. Hardware stores, law offices, a pharmacy where the pharmacists still knew customers by name.
On a bitter winter morning in Georgetown, Delaware, the kind of morning where frost clings to window panes and breath hangs visible in the air, a young woman named Lindsay Bonestall left her apartment to begin what should have been an ordinary day. She was 19 years old, a student at Delaware Technical Community College, working part-time at a local retail store to help pay for her education. She had sandy blonde hair that fell past her shoulders, a quick smile, and the determined stride of someone who knew exactly where she was going. That morning was January 21, 2007. Lindsay never made it to her destination. By nightfall, her family would be frantic. By week's end, investigators would be searching fields and waterways. By month's end, Georgetown would become the kind of town that locks its doors after dark and watches strangers with suspicious eyes. And for nearly 13 years, one question would haunt this small Delaware community, whispered in diners and grocery store aisles, discussed in hushed tones at church gatherings and town meetings. What happened to Lindsay Bonestall? Georgetown sits in Sussex County, the southernmost county in Delaware, a place where farmland stretches toward the horizon and small towns carry names that echo colonial history. The county seat, Georgetown, is home to roughly 7,000 people, though that number swells during summer months when tourists pass through on their way to the Atlantic beaches 30 minutes east. In 2007, Georgetown was the kind of place where neighbors knew each other's business, where the local diner served as an informal community center, where high school football games drew crowds that spilled from the bleachers onto the grass. The town center featured a historic circle, a peculiar roundabout where Main Street curved around the old Sussex County Courthouse, a brick building with white columns that had stood since 1839. Around this circle, local businesses occupied buildings that had served the community for generations. Hardware stores, law offices, a pharmacy where the pharmacist still knew customers by name. Lindsay had grown up not in Georgetown proper, but in the surrounding countryside, in a modest ranch house on a road where mailboxes stood at long intervals and corn grew tall in summer months. Her parents, Michael and Patricia Bonestall, had raised 3 children there. Michael worked in construction, his hands calloused from years of outdoor labor, his face weathered by sun and wind. Patricia worked at a nursing home, the kind of job that required patience and compassion, qualities she possessed in abundance. They were not wealthy people, but they were steady people, the kind who paid their bills on time and helped neighbors when help was needed. Lindsay was their middle child, sandwiched between an older brother who had joined the military and a younger sister still in high school. By January 2007, Lindsay had moved into a small apartment in Georgetown, a ground-floor unit in a complex off Route 113, the main artery running through Sussex County. The apartment was nothing special, just 2 bedrooms and a bathroom with linoleum floors and walls painted builder-grade white, but it represented independence. She shared the space with a roommate, another young woman named Jessica who worked at the same retail store. Their schedules often conflicted, ships passing in the night, but they got along well enough. The apartment smelled faintly of vanilla candles that Lindsay kept burning on the kitchen counter. A small television sat on a particle board entertainment center in the living room. Textbooks were stacked on the coffee table, their spines cracked from repeated use. That Sunday morning, January 21, dawned cold and overcast. The temperature hovered just above freezing. No snow had fallen, but the grass crunched underfoot with frost, and puddles from recent rain had frozen into irregular patches of ice. Lindsay woke around 8:30, earlier than she preferred on a weekend but later than she would have risen on a school day. Her roommate had already left for work. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the building settling. Lindsay moved through her morning routine with the efficiency of repetition. Shower, coffee, cereal eaten standing at the kitchen counter while checking her phone for messages. She dressed in jeans and a thick sweater, layered beneath a navy blue winter coat her mother had given her for Christmas. She pulled on boots, not fashionable ones but practical ones with treads designed for winter weather. She grabbed her purse, a worn brown leather bag that contained her wallet, her phone, her keys, a lipstick, random receipts, and the accumulated debris of daily life. Around 9:45, Lindsay left her apartment. Clear's throat, according to what investigators would later piece together from phone records and witness statements. She intended to drive to her parents' house to pick up some belongings she had left there over the holiday break. The drive should have taken approximately 25 minutes, a straight shot down Route 113, and then west on country roads toward the rural address where she had grown up. Her car, a 1998 Honda Civic with fading green paint, and a dent in the rear bumper from a minor parking lot incident years earlier, was parked in its usual spot in the apartment complex lot. Security cameras at the complex entrance, grainy and poorly maintained, would later show her vehicle leaving at 9:52 in the morning. Lindsay never arrived at her parents' house. Patricia Bonestall, who had been expecting her daughter, called Lindsay's cell phone around 10:30. No answer. She called again at 11, again at 11:30. By noon, concern had begun to creep into Patricia's thoughts, that maternal instinct that something was wrong even when logic suggested otherwise. Young people forgot to charge their phones. Young people got distracted. Young people changed plans without thinking to inform their parents. But Patricia knew her daughter, knew her habits and patterns, knew that Lindsay was reliable about communication. By 1 o'clock, Patricia called Lindsay's roommate. Jessica had not heard from Lindsay since the previous evening. Patricia called Lindsay's friends, her coworkers, anyone who might know where she had gone. No one had seen her. No one had heard from her. At 2:15 that afternoon, Michael Bonestall drove to his daughter's apartment. He found her parking spot empty. He knocked on the apartment door. No answer. He called his wife. Patricia's voice carried the tremor of escalating panic. Michael drove the route his daughter should have taken from her apartment to their house, his eyes scanning roadsides for any sign of the green Honda Civic, for any indication of where she might have stopped or what might have happened. He saw nothing. At 3:47, Michael Bonestall called the Georgetown Police Department to report his daughter missing. The initial response was measured, almost dismissive. 19-year-old adults did not legally qualify as missing persons after only a few hours. Young women changed plans. They visited friends. They extended errands. The desk officer who took Michael's call made notes but suggested waiting until morning. Michael's voice rose. This was not like his daughter. Something was wrong. He knew it. A parent knows. The officer, perhaps hearing the desperation, perhaps recognizing that small-town Delaware could not afford to ignore potential trouble, agreed to file an official report and notify patrol units. By nightfall, as streetlights flickered on across Georgetown and the temperature dropped into the 20s, Lindsay Bonestall had been missing for nearly 10 hours. Her phone went straight to voicemail, suggesting either a dead battery or a powered-off device. Her bank account showed no activity after a small purchase at a convenience store 2 days earlier. Her social media accounts, checked by her frantic younger sister, showed no updates. Her car had simply vanished. And in that cold January darkness, as Patricia Bonestall sat at her kitchen table unable to eat or think or do anything but stare at her silent phone, Georgetown prepared for what would become one of the most haunting mysteries in Delaware history. The formal search began Monday morning, January 22, at first light. Georgetown police coordinated with the Sussex County Sheriff's Office and Delaware State Police, understanding immediately that a missing person case involving a young woman required maximum resources. By 7 in the morning, more than 40 officers had assembled at the Georgetown Police Station, a low brick building on South Bedford Street. Maps were spread across tables in the briefing room. Assignments were distributed. Search zones were designated based on the route Lindsay should have taken and expanded outward in concentric circles. Patrol vehicles began systematically driving every road, every back lane, every farm path within a 10-mile radius of Georgetown. Officers knocked on doors. They questioned residents. They asked farmers to check their properties, their barns, their outbuildings. By midday Monday, volunteer search parties had formed. Word spread through Georgetown with the velocity that only small-town concern could generate. The local radio station broadcast appeals for information. The Delaware Coast Press ran a front-page story with Lindsay's photograph, that same school picture her parents had submitted, showing her smiling with her head tilted slightly, her eyes bright with the optimism of youth. Approximately 200 volunteers assembled at the Georgetown Fire Hall, a cavernous metal building on Ray Street. They divided into teams, each led by a firefighter or police officer, each assigned a specific sector. They walked through fields where stubble from last year's corn crop poked through frozen ground. They searched wooded areas where bare trees stood like sentinels. They checked drainage ditches and creek beds. They called Lindsay's name until their voices grew hoarse. The community response was overwhelming. Local restaurants donated food for searchers. Churches organized prayer vigils. The high school where Lindsay's younger sister was a junior held an assembly where students made missing person flyers. These flyers appeared everywhere, taped to storefront windows, pinned to community bulletin boards, stapled to telephone poles. Lindsay's face stared out from gas station doors and grocery store entrances. her smile frozen in that captured moment. The words "missing" and "please help" printed in bold letters beneath her photograph. Meanwhile, investigators began the painstaking work of reconstructing Lindsay's final known movements. They obtained her cell phone records, which showed her last activity at 9:43 that Sunday morning, a brief text message to a friend confirming plans for later in the week. The message was unremarkable, casual, the kind of communication that suggested nothing unusual. Tower data indicated the phone's last ping came from a cell tower on Route 113, consistent with her stated route. After that, silence. Either the phone had been turned off or the battery had died, or the device had been destroyed or moved to a location beyond tower range. Security footage from businesses along Route 113 was collected and reviewed. The footage quality was poor, typical of early 2000s surveillance technology, but investigators could identify several vehicles matching the description of Lindsay's Honda Civic, passing various locations. None of the footage was clear enough to definitively confirm the driver's identity or to show where the vehicle might have turned off the main road. Clear's throat, a clerk at a small convenience store about 8 miles south of Georgetown, reported seeing a green Honda Civic pulled over on the shoulder of Route 113 around 10:15 that Sunday morning, but could not confirm whether anyone was with the vehicle or what direction it had been heading. As Monday became Tuesday and Tuesday became Wednesday, the search expanded. State police aviation units flew overhead with thermal imaging cameras, hopping to detect any heat signature that might indicate a person or recently used vehicle. The searches focused increasingly on water, the dark reality of missing person investigations asserting itself. Sussex County contains numerous ponds, creeks, and drainage canals, agricultural waterways that crisscross the flat landscape. Dive teams from the Delaware State Police submerged into murky waters, their visibility measured in inches, their gloved hands searching through silt and vegetation. They found nothing. By the end of the first week, investigators had interviewed more than 150 people. Friends described Lindsay as responsible and level-headed, not someone who would simply disappear without contact. Coworkers said she had seemed normal during her last shift, chatting about classes and making plans for spring break. Professors at Delaware Tech reported she had been attending regularly and performing adequately in her coursework. Her ex-boyfriend, a young man she had dated briefly during high school, was located and interviewed. He had not spoken to Lindsay in months and had a solid alibi, having been visiting relatives in Pennsylvania that entire weekend. Bank records confirmed no unusual activity. There were no threatening messages on her phone or social media, no angry former friends, no stalkers, no enemies. Lindsay Bonestall appeared to be exactly what her family insisted she was, an ordinary young woman living an ordinary life, and then she had simply ceased to exist. Those who knew the family said Michael Bonestall aged years in those first weeks. His face became drawn, his eyes hollow with sleeplessness. He spent daylight hours searching, retracing routes, questioning anyone who would speak with him. Patricia moved through her house like a ghost, unable to focus on anything except the phone she kept clutched in her hand, waiting for a call that never came. Their younger daughter withdrew, skipping school, refusing to eat. The family existed in a liminal space, unable to grieve because there was no confirmation of loss, unable to hope because each passing day made the statistical likelihood of finding Lindsay alive diminish exponentially. Deputies whispered quietly among themselves about what they were not finding. No body, no car, no physical evidence of foul play. In missing person cases, especially those involving young women, the absence of evidence often told its own story, and that story was rarely good. But without a crime scene, without a body, without witnesses, investigators had nothing concrete to pursue. They interviewed registered offenders in the area. They reviewed similar cases from surrounding states. They contacted the FBI, which provided assistance but could not officially join the investigation without evidence of interstate activity or specific federal jurisdiction. The case was not technically cold, but it had gone dormant, the initial flurry of activity giving way to the grinding reality that sometimes people vanish, and the answers vanish with them. By spring 2007, the daily searches had ceased. The volunteer teams had disbanded. The missing person flyers had begun to fade and peel from their postings, weathered by rain and sun. Lindsay Bonestall's case remained open, technically active, but no new leads emerged. Her apartment sat empty, her belongings packed by her mother into boxes that were stored in the Bonestall garage. Her room in her parents' house remained untouched, a shrine to a girl who had not lived there for years but whose absence filled every corner of the space. The community, which had rallied with such intensity in those first terrible weeks, gradually returned to normal rhythms. Life continued. Georgetown streets filled with summer tourists heading to the beaches. The corn grew tall again. The high school football season began and ended. Christmas came and went. For the Bonestall family, no such return to normalcy was possible. Patricia left her job at the nursing home, unable to focus, unable to function in any role that required her to care for others when she could not even care for herself. Michael continued working, needing the distraction, needing the physical exhaustion to quiet his mind enough to sleep at night. Their marriage, once solid and unremarkable in the way of long partnerships, began to show fractures. Grief has a way of isolating people even when they share the same loss. Michael wanted to talk about Lindsay constantly, to keep her present through memory and story. Patricia could not speak her daughter's name without breaking down. Michael grew angry at Patricia's silence. Patricia grew resentful of Michael's insistence. They moved around each other like strangers in their own home. By 2008, they had separated. Not divorced, not officially, but living apart. The strain too much to bear while occupying the same space. Michael remained in the family home. Patricia moved into a small rental near downtown Georgetown, a place where every room did not echo with memories of children growing up. Their younger daughter, having finished high school, left for college in Maryland, eager to escape the suffocating grief that had transformed her childhood home into something unrecognizable. The years accumulated. 2009, 2010, 2011. Lindsay's case appeared occasionally in local media on anniversaries, those grim markers of time's passage. 5 years missing, 7 years missing, 10 years missing. Each article contained the same photograph, that same school picture, Lindsay forever frozen at 19, forever smiling that hopeful smile. The articles recounted the known facts, the mysterious disappearance, the extensive search, the lack of resolution. They included appeals for information. They provided a tip line number. They went nowhere. For those who have ever doubted someone you love, ever felt that cold uncertainty that perhaps the person you thought you knew was different than you imagined, the waiting must be unbearable. Patricia Bonestall told a local reporter in 2012, on the 5-year anniversary of her daughter's disappearance, that she sometimes woke from nightmares in which Lindsay was calling for help, but Patricia could not find her. She said she sometimes saw young women who resembled her daughter and would follow them for blocks, her heart hammering, before the woman would turn and reveal a stranger's face. She said the not knowing was worse than any certain ending could be, that at least with certainty came the possibility of closure, of moving forward, of accepting what could not be changed. Georgetown changed in subtle ways during those years. The economy struggled through recession. Businesses closed. New ones opened. The demographics shifted as retirees discovered Sussex County's lower cost of living and proximity to beaches. But for those who remembered January 2007, who had participated in those searches or hung those flyers or prayed in those vigils, the question remained: what happened to Lindsay Bonestall? Theories circulated, as they always do. Some believed she had run away, started a new life somewhere far from Delaware, though this theory required ignoring everything known about her character and her circumstances. Some believed she had been taken, become the victim of some random predator who had seen an opportunity on that cold Sunday morning. Some believed the answer was simpler and darker, that she had met with some accident, that her car had gone off the road into some hidden pond or creek, that someday someone would stumble upon the wreckage. But as 2015 became 2016, and 2016 became 2017, as the 10th anniversary approached and passed, even these theories felt more like ritual than genuine investigation. Clear's throat. Cold cases go cold because leads evaporate, because witnesses' memories fade, because evidence degrades, because the urgent present always demands more attention than the unresolved past. Lindsay Bonestall's file sat in the Georgetown Police Department, a box of documents and photographs and interview transcripts, occasionally reviewed but essentially dormant. The detective who had initially led the investigation had retired. New officers came on the force who had not been present during those first frantic weeks. The case became historical, something older officers mentioned to newer ones, a cautionary tale about the mysteries that sometimes resist solution. In 2019, Delaware established a new cold case unit within the state police, a small team of detectives dedicated specifically to reviewing unsolved cases with fresh eyes and new technology. The unit was small, just 3 detectives and a civilian analyst, but they had resources that local departments lacked. They had access to updated forensic techniques, to national databases, to genetic genealogy services that had revolutionized cold case investigations in recent years. They began systematically reviewing every unsolved missing person case in Delaware going back 3 decades. Lindsay Bonestall's case was on their list. Detective Sarah Pemberton drew the assignment in April 2019. She was 41 years old, a veteran investigator who had worked everything from fraud to homicide during her 18 years with Delaware State Police. She had requested transfer to the cold case unit specifically because she believed in the work, believed that victims and families deserved answers regardless of how much time had passed. She began with the file, reading every report, every witness statement, every search log. She created a timeline on a whiteboard in the unit's office, mapping Lindsay's last known movements with minute-by-minute precision. She reviewed the cell phone records again, comparing them against tower locations and coverage maps from 2007. She re-interviewed witnesses whose statements seemed incomplete or contradictory. Most were willing to talk. Some had moved away. A few had passed away in the intervening years. Detective Pemberton focused on the vehicle. A 1998 Honda Civic is not a rare car, but it is also not invisible. For a vehicle to vanish completely suggested either it had been destroyed immediately or it had been hidden deliberately. She contacted junkyards and salvage yards across Delaware and into Maryland and Pennsylvania, asking for records from January and February 2007. Most yards kept poor records from that long ago, but she obtained what she could. She contacted the Delaware DMV, requesting any records of title transfers or registration changes for that specific vehicle. The car had never been re-registered. Its VIN had never appeared in any database since 2007. This strongly suggested the vehicle had been destroyed or was still hidden somewhere. By September 2019, Detective Pemberton had exhausted most conventional investigative avenues without generating new leads. But she had one tool available that had not existed in 2007: advanced geolocation analysis. She contacted a private technology firm that specialized in historical cell tower analysis, providing them with every piece of cell tower data from Lindsay's phone on that Sunday morning. The firm used mapping software and 2007 tower coverage data to generate a more precise tracking of where Lindsay's phone had been during those final minutes of activity. The analysis revealed something interesting. The final ping, previously assumed to place Lindsay somewhere on Route 113, actually suggested a location slightly west of the highway, possibly on one of the farm roads that intersected that area. Detective Pemberton drove to that location, a rural intersection where Route 113 met a narrow two-lane road called Coastal Highway Extension. It was farmland mostly, with a few scattered houses set back from the road. One property, a farm that had been in the same family for generations, sat at the southwest corner of the intersection. The farmhouse was old but well-maintained, white clapboard with a metal roof. A large barn stood behind it, gray wood weathered by decades of exposure. Various outbuildings dotted the property. The farm's owners, an elderly couple named William and Helen Garrett, had lived there since the 1970s. Their son, Thomas Garrett, 46 years old in 2019, lived there as well, occupying a small trailer on the property. Detective Pemberton knocked on the farmhouse door on a Tuesday afternoon in October 2019. Helen Garrett answered, a woman in her mid-70s with white hair and guarded eyes. Pemberton identified herself and explained she was reviewing a missing person case from 2007. Had anyone from the family been interviewed at that time? Helen said she did not recall any police coming to their property during the searches, though she remembered them searching nearby fields. Had they seen anything unusual on Sunday, January 21, 2007? Helen shook her head. That was 12 years ago. She could barely remember last week, much less a specific Sunday from over a decade ago. Pemberton asked about Thomas Garrett. Helen's expression shifted, became more protective. Thomas had some difficulties, she said. He was not quite right, had never been quite right. What kind of difficulties? Helen hesitated. Developmental issues, she finally said. He had trouble holding jobs. He lived in the trailer and helped around the farm when he could. Had he been around that Sunday in January 2007? Helen said she supposed so. Thomas rarely went anywhere. Pemberton asked if she could speak with him. Helen said he was in town running errands but should be back shortly. Pemberton waited. Thomas Garrett arrived 45 minutes later, driving a pickup truck that had seen better decades. He was a large man, over 6 feet tall and heavy, with thinning hair and a face that seemed younger than his years. He approached Pemberton with a curious expression, not quite friendly but not hostile. Pemberton introduced herself and explained she was reviewing an old missing person case. Had Thomas heard about the young woman who went missing in 2007? Thomas shook his head slowly. Pemberton showed him Lindsay's photograph. Recognition flickered across Thomas's face, quick and unmistakable before his expression went blank again. He said he did not know her. Had he seen anything unusual on January 21, 2007? Thomas said that was a long time ago. He did not remember. Something about the interaction bothered Detective Pemberton. That flicker of recognition, the too quick denial, the way Thomas's mother had positioned herself in the doorway, watching, listening. Pemberton thanked them both and left, but she made notes. She ran Thomas Garrett's name through databases. He had a few minor infractions, traffic violations, nothing serious. He had never been interviewed during the initial investigation in 2007, likely because the searches had focused on the main roads, and the Garrett property sat just outside the initial search radius. Detective Pemberton began surveilling the Garrett property. not continuously but periodically driving past, observing from distances, noting patterns. Thomas Garrett kept irregular hours, sometimes visible working around the property, sometimes absent for days. The farm itself seemed to be slowly deteriorating, the barns and outbuildings in increasing disrepair. Pemberton pulled property records. The farm comprised 83 acres, much of it wooded or fallow. She obtained satellite imagery from 2007 and compared it to current imagery, looking for any significant changes. One of the outbuildings, a long metal structure that appeared to be a machinery shed, had been there in 2007, but showed different features in more recent images. In November 2019, Detective Pemberton met with the Sussex County prosecutor to discuss the case. She laid out what she had, which was not much. Cell tower data that suggested Lindsay's phone had been near the Garrett property when it went dark. A possible flash of recognition when shown Lindsay's photograph. A family with a large, relatively isolated property that had never been thoroughly searched. The prosecutor was skeptical. None of this rose to the level needed for a search warrant. Pemberton knew he was right, but instinct told her she was looking in the right direction. She continued working the case, re-interviewing people who lived along Route 113 in 2007, showing them Thomas Garrett's photograph, asking if they remembered seeing him around that time. Most people did not remember. One person, a woman who had worked at a gas station near the Route 113 intersection, said the name sounded familiar, but she could not be certain. Pemberton went back through the original investigation files, looking for any mention of the Garrett property or Thomas Garrett's name. Nothing. In February 2020, as the world began to reckon with the emerging pandemic, Detective Pemberton received an unexpected call. The caller was a man named Robert Chen, a former friend of Thomas Garrett who had moved to California years ago, but had recently been contacted by someone looking into old Delaware connections. Chen said he had information about Thomas Garrett that might be relevant. Could they talk? Pemberton arranged a video call. Robert Chen explained that he and Thomas had been friends in the early 2000s, before Chen had moved west. Thomas had always been a bit odd, Chen said, socially awkward, prone to obsessive interests. In 2007, around February or March, Chen had visited the Garrett farm and noticed Thomas acting strangely. Thomas had seemed nervous, jumpy, unwilling to let Chen into certain buildings on the property. When Chen had asked what was wrong, Thomas had brushed it off, said he was dealing with some personal issues. But Chen remembered seeing what looked like fresh concrete in the floor of one of the outbuildings, which struck him as odd because Thomas was not the type to do home improvements. Chen had forgotten about the incident until recently, when thinking about his old life in Delaware triggered the memory. Detective Pemberton felt the case shift. This was not evidence, not yet, but it was corroboration of her instincts. She brought Chen's statement to the prosecutor. Combined with the cell tower data and the other circumstantial elements, they now had enough to request a search warrant for the Garrett property. The warrant was issued on March 4, 2020, just days before the pandemic would shut down normal operations across the country. On March 6, 2020, at 6 in the morning, a convoy of Delaware State Police vehicles converged on the Garrett farm. Detective Pemberton led the operation, accompanied by forensic technicians, cadaver dogs, and ground-penetrating radar equipment. William and Helen Garrett were escorted from their home and kept under supervision while the search proceeded. Thomas Garrett was located in his trailer and detained for questioning, not under arrest but not free to leave. The search focused on the outbuildings. In the metal machinery shed, investigators found what Robert Chen had described, a section of concrete floor that appeared newer than surrounding areas. The cadaver dogs showed interest in this section. Ground-penetrating radar indicated a disturbance beneath the concrete. Investigators brought in jackhammers and began breaking through the concrete. Beneath, about 3 feet down, they found plastic sheeting. Beneath the plastic, human remains. The remains were badly decomposed, skeletal, but clothing fragments remained intact enough to identify. Navy blue winter coat, jeans, boots, a brown leather purse nearby containing a wallet with a driver's license. The license bore Lindsay Bonistall's name and photograph. Investigators continued excavating carefully, treating the site as both a recovery operation and a crime scene. They found additional items: a cell phone consistent with the model Lindsay had carried, jewelry matching descriptions her family had provided. 30 feet away, behind another outbuilding, investigators found a pile of rusted metal and automotive parts partially covered by tarps. Beneath the tarps, they discovered the remains of a vehicle, a green Honda Civic, its VIN matching the vehicle registered to Lindsay Bonistall. The car had been partially disassembled, its engine removed, its identification numbers ground off in some places but still visible in others. The vehicle was in the process of being destroyed but had not been completed. Thomas Garrett was arrested that afternoon and charged with concealment of death pending autopsy results. He remained silent during initial questioning, invoking his right to counsel. His parents, shocked and adamant about their son's innocence, retained a defense attorney. The story exploded across Delaware media, the shocking resolution to a case that had haunted Georgetown for 13 years. News helicopters hovered over the Garrett farm. Reporters camped outside the Sussex County Courthouse. The Bonistall family issued a statement through their attorney expressing relief at finally having answers, but requesting privacy during their grief. The autopsy, conducted by the Delaware Medical Examiner's Office, revealed that Lindsay Bonistall had been struck on the head with a blunt object, causing a skull fracture that would have been fatal or near fatal. The medical examiner could not determine the exact sequence of events due to decomposition, but concluded the manner of death was homicide. Additional forensic analysis of the concrete and surrounding area found blood evidence consistent with Lindsay's DNA. Investigators theorized that she had been brought to the Garrett property, either by force or deception, and had been struck during a struggle or attack. Thomas Garrett had then buried her body and hidden her vehicle, intending to dispose of both more thoroughly, but had never completed the process. In April 2020, as the world struggled with pandemic restrictions and Delaware courthouses operated under emergency protocols, Thomas Garrett was formally charged with second-degree murder. His attorneys argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that someone else could have used his property without his knowledge, that the prosecution could not definitively prove he had caused Lindsay's passing. But as investigators continued analyzing evidence from the property and from Thomas's trailer, the case against him strengthened. They found internet searches on his computer from early 2007, searches about decomposition in concrete and how police investigate missing persons. They found photographs on an old digital camera, photographs of Lindsay taken without her knowledge, showing her at her workplace, at her apartment complex, in her car. The trial began in September 2021, delayed by pandemic-related court closures. Prosecutors presented their case methodically. Cell tower evidence placing Lindsay's phone near Thomas's property. Robert Chen's testimony about the fresh concrete, the forensic evidence from the burial site and the concealed vehicle, the computer searches and the photographs. Thomas's mother testified reluctantly that Thomas had seemed different in the weeks after January 2007, anxious and secretive, spending long hours in the outbuildings. The defense argued reasonable doubt, questioned the reliability of cell tower data from 2007, suggested that someone else could have committed the crime and used the Garrett property as a dump site. But the accumulated weight of evidence, the photographs especially, painted a portrait of obsession and opportunity. Thomas Garrett had fixated on Lindsay Bonestall, had followed her, had known her routines. On that Sunday morning in January 2007, their paths had intersected, perhaps by chance or perhaps because Thomas had engineered the meeting. What had happened next remained unclear in specific details, but the outcome was undeniable. Lindsay Bonestall had been taken, had been struck down, had been buried in a shallow grave beneath fresh concrete, and Thomas Garrett had hidden the evidence and said nothing for 13 years. On November 12, 2021, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on all charges. Thomas Garrett sat motionless as the verdict was read, his face expressionless. His parents wept quietly in the courtroom gallery. The Bonestall family embraced each other, tears streaming down their faces, the relief of resolution mixed with the grief of confirmation. Sentencing came 6 weeks later. Thomas Garrett received 40 years in prison with no possibility of parole. He remained silent, offering no apology, no explanation, no acknowledgement of what he had done. The case closed officially in January 2022, exactly 15 years after Lindsay Bonestall disappeared. Delaware State Police issued a press release commending Detective Pemberton's work and highlighting how advances in investigative technology had made the resolution possible. Georgetown held a memorial service for Lindsay at the same church where vigils had been held 15 years earlier. Hundreds attended. Patricia and Michael Bonestall spoke briefly, thanking everyone who had never stopped hopping for answers. They had buried their daughter finally, laid her to rest in a cemetery on the edge of town, her gravestone bearing her name and dates and the words, "Forever in our hearts." For those who have ever wondered whether justice delayed is justice denied, the Bonestall case offers a complicated answer. 13 years is a long time to wait. 13 years is most of a childhood, all of a young adulthood. It is marriages and divorces and moves and jobs and seasons cycling endlessly while one question remains unanswered. But 13 years is not forever, and answers, even painful answers, carry their own kind of power. Lindsay Bonestall's story did not end on that January morning in 2007, though that is when her life ended. Her story continued through searches and vigils and years of uncertainty, through a detective's instinct and a cold case unit's resources, through technology that did not exist when she disappeared but that eventually helped reveal what had happened to her. Georgetown remembers. The town still locks its doors after dark, but perhaps now for different reasons. Thomas Garrett's name has become a local cautionary tale, a reminder that danger sometimes wears a familiar face, lives on a familiar road, exists in the spaces between what people show the world and what they hide from it. Lindsay's photograph, that same school picture, hangs in the Georgetown Police Department, not as a missing person anymore, but as a memorial, a reminder of why the work matters, why investigators pursue answers even when trails go cold, why families never stop hopping. If this story mattered to you, subscribe and hit the bell. Share the episode. Someone somewhere may still be waiting to be heard.